I've been obsessed with the new Band Camino song, What Am I Missing? So much so that I wanted to see if I could recreate it from scratch. So in a couple of hours, this is what I was able to come up with. And I want to show you guys how I did it. But first, if you haven't already, hit subscribe. So I think the main part of this instrumental are the guitars, which I would break up into two major categories. The acoustic guitars that we have here and the electric guitars that we have here. Let's focus on the electrics first. All of the electrics for this track were tracked using this. This is my Epiphone Prophecy Les Paul. I think most people who try to get that Band Camino sound are really struggling because they're using a guitar that's just not built for that sound. One of the biggest reasons why I use this guitar is because it has Fishman Fluence pickups, which are an active pickup, and it really helps give you that aggressive in-your-face sound, especially when you're using really high gain tones. So in the verse, we just have this one electric guitar part. All of these guys are double tracked, by the way. Pretty much all the guitar tones for this track I got using Nolly Neural DSP. I just adjusted this insert riffs here preset. And by the way, if anybody wants to know the best way to dial in guitar tones for something like this, here's what you do. You get a usable preset going, you track all of your stuff, you have it loop over a section, and then you start adjusting your tone. Sometimes you can fool yourself into thinking that a patch has a lot of attack and you're just hearing the noise of you picking it in the room. So I would recommend looping a section that is already recorded so that you can dial in an accurate patch. Something else that can really help shape a tone is messing with the IRs inside of an amp sim. Like, you just become familiar with, like, okay, what does a 57 normally sound like? What does a 421 sound like? Until you get the frequency response you're looking for. Most people I know get freaked out by it, and I don't think it's necessary. It's actually pretty straightforward. We then layer that up with some MoTT, just to sort of level it out from a frequency standpoint, a little bit of EQ. I know that scooping the mids can be kind of cringe, but in my perspective, this is a pop song, and the guitars are basically just like a massive synth layer. And after this palm muty part, we have this section over here. I actually went in and like hard cutted them and added fade outs to every single hit. Kind of like what you can see I did here on these top ones. But on top of these power chords, we actually have these really big, wide, full chords playing. Even though we're using a stupid high gain patch, I'm strumming all 6 strings. All of the notes are audible. You don't have notes folding back on each other. And altogether, those sound like this. I think another thing that was important with these guitars is using EQ specifically to focus in on what kind of part it is. So for example, these low guitars that we have here, for the EQ, I have a really low high pass filter at around 30 hertz. But for these higher guys that are more of like a lead tone, the high pass is up to like 280. Didn't really need the low end from them. I needed the sort of higher end from them. If I took all of those EQs off, this is what they would sound like. And then subtly underneath all of that, we have our acoustic layers, which sound like this. And as you can hear, we're kind of just playing the same thing that we're playing on the electrics. We have some power chords going. We have sort of a higher voiced D thing. For mixing these acoustics, I just kind of did a basic chain, a little bit of R comp on individual guitars, some EQ shaping, a bit of Kramer tape on the 7.5 IPS speed, and then a little bit of MoTT. So here's what all of them sound like dry. And here's what they sound like processed. And it's really weird, but when you have all of these guitars that are kind of playing the same voicings stacked on top of each other, and their tones are so wildly different, they're able to sound like a large group of guitars stacked on top of each other without seeming overwhelming. Like, for people who know production stuff, they can probably dissect how many layers are there. But if you're just an average listener, you probably wouldn't think there's 8. Also, for the outro, we have this little lead line here. Basically the same guitar patch, only I turned up the gain a lot more. And that's something worth noting because with all the other guitar patches, I actually turned the gain down because when you have multiple layers of distorted guitars on top of one another, it's really easy for them to just sort of fill up the frequency spectrum like a ton when you have like a ton of gain on all of the patches. So instead, I turned the gain down on the ones that were more like rhythm patches. Also, a fun thing is if you want to make sure your guitar solos are perfectly in tune, you can throw on a little bit of auto tune, and they have this instrument mode. I also threw some decapitator on it and a little bit of H delay. Honestly, guys, if you need to get like a guitar solo or something like that to like pop out on top of a mix, it's almost always adding a slap delay. But anyway, on that same bus, we also have a couple of synth leads underneath it, just doubling up on the same notes. Just using the Mitch Murder lead from Anna 2. Now let's look at the bass. For this, I'm using the punk bass from Submission Audio. This is my go-to for picked bass that is going to be in some kind of rock song. There's a built-in amplifier here, but I normally turn it off because my preferred chain is through Parallax by Neural DSP. I made a few modifications to this Dave Otero punch preset. So if I turn that off, this is what the DI just sounds like straight. And now here's with Parallax. It's like sloppy and distorted and it's perfect. I love it. And then I needed to palm mute for a little bit earlier in the song, and Punk Bass doesn't actually have a palm mute feature. So what I did was I took this auto filter in Ableton and I automated the highs to cut out for a majority of that part, which to me kind of sounds like a muted bass thing. For a little bit of beef underneath that bass, we also added this synth layer, which is this essential preset in Anna 2. I just wanted to add like a little bit of a mid-range booster that I could layer underneath. So here you can see I had it at like -20 because it's just adding a bit of filler. I also have a couple of Junos that are doing something pretty similar. Like if you look at the spectrum analyzer here on the EQ, we're really just trying to get these like pokey little harmonics to come out and emphasize the rest of the chords that are going on. We've doubled it up in a couple of octaves just to sort of get a bit of width with it. So here's the high octave. Here's the low octave. We also have some pads in Arcade, just to add a little bit of ambience to it. I'm using some pretty aggressive high pass and low pass filters on these 4x settings on the EQ, which by the way, normally you don't want to do because you can actually introduce phasing problems if you're using like a really steep EQ. But for this sound, whenever I had them on like the more tame high pass and low pass settings that I normally used, I just felt that like there was too much bleeding in from the other sides. So I made it super narrow like this. Another thing that I did to sort of bring out the space was I added a reverb going into one knob pumper because I wanted there to actually be like this clean like pumping motion happening on top of this ambient vocal. I didn't want it to just be this moving thing that had reverb on it. I wanted it to be like an ambient sample that was like pumping with the song. Last element here we have are these drums. Just using the Luke Holland kit from Mixwave. Then we have a little bit of MoTT going in. The actual like vibe that it's adding to the drums is almost like what you would get with parallel compression. So if I turn it off, and then if I turn it on, like with these multi-band effects, you need to be careful with them that you don't like completely crush your sound, but for this, it felt like really appropriate. Another thing that I did to get the drums super tight on these stops here is I actually automated the gain to die down, which is what you can hear on the original song. It doesn't just feel like da 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 da. Like you can hear like a cut happening on the track. You hear da 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 da. I just added a utility plugin here and I just did a hard cut at these certain spots so that the drums stopped ringing out. So if I take it off, you can hear versus Really cool. Some other fun elements we have going here are these hats, which are a fun element. They're like the only 16th note element that's really adding that speed, because if I'd like take them off, if I add them in, they just add that sort of like little extra like juice to it, keeps things moving fast. So if I take off all the processing, these are actually just like pretty basic hi-hats. They're pretty heavily cut to transient, so this is what they originally sounded like. Then I lowered the transient envelope to like 3. Just get that little staccato thing going. Ran them into some decapitator to sort of grunge them up. High pass them because I didn't really want that like low end from the hi-hats. I wanted just like the pure, almost white noise high end. And then this is a really great plugin called PanFlow, which is free, by the way, if you want to get it, from a company called Audio Modern. And it's this automatic pan automation thing. It's super random. So if you listen to the loop and look at the line, it's like panning it to like the left and the right based off of this guy. And if you hit this button, it will randomly generate a new pattern, and you can give it parameters for what kind of random pattern you want. Maybe you want it to be a little bit more hard edged or rounder or random. Maybe you want it to be super fine tuned. There's just so many parameters to it, and there's a wet and a dry signal, and you can control the envelope out of it. It's really cool. I'm honestly kind of surprised that it's free. But yeah, all this culminates in a track that is just really nice and sizzly to just layer underneath the drum kit. And then something that I really wanted to do was get that sort of like lo-fi drum break thing that they did going into like the hook after the chorus, which I got, and here's how I did it. So I played a beat here on the Luke Holland kit and I bounced it down as audio. I then messed around with this plugin, which is really fun, and I've been having a great time with it. It's Futzbox by McDSP. There's a bunch of like really cool, like cheap cell phone models. Without it, it sounds like this. With it, it sounds like this. And I wanted that sort of like weird flanger effect, so I actually automated this tune knob to sort of fade up as it goes by. After that, I ran it through some decapitator to get it grungy again. And then I wanted it to feel like a drum break, so I threw on some Valhalla Vintage Verb. And then just to sort of make that cut a little bit cleaner, I added this utility plugin to make it like a hard cut after that drum beat plays, almost as if it was like a sample from a dirty kit that you had taken. And then also as these little effects, we have this clap impact with a riser leading into it. So all these effects layered in with the full drum kit, they sound really nice. And those are all the instruments that we have for the song. For my master bus, I'm just using a little bit of Soothe. This Balance to the Grammy Awards preset is really nice. I like using it a lot. It tends to focus a lot on those hyper resonant frequencies that tend to be unpleasant. Also, I've recently fallen back in love with Slate Virtual Bus Compressor. I stopped using it for a long time just because I wanted to challenge myself to like learn compression. But since coming back to it after mastering stuff for a while, I really like it. And I love how like pumpy it can get something sounding. And then another plugin that I'm really in love with is the Leapwing Dyne 1, which is like a really nice multi-band compressor. I saw Ilangelo use this at NAMM on the Weekends stuff, and I was just kind of sold immediately. You just kind of raise these green faders up when it's in parallel mode until you get that like sort of mid-range bump that you want, and it sounds good every time. And then just using L1 to get the volume up for this video. And with that, let's look at what it sounds like when we put it all together. How close do you guys think I got to the original song? Put it down in the comments below. Also, if you have any other indie pop tracks that you would like to see recreated from scratch, put them down in the comments. I love doing recreation stuff like this. So yeah, I will see you guys next week.